What exactly was the sin that the people that built the Tower of Babel committed? And in all honesty, just to be clear about it, I've actually preached this lesson before. Fortunately for you, it was in 2016, pretty early on in my preaching career here, which means you don't remember it, and it means I don't remember it. But there are things that are worth repeating, and there are things that are worth remembering. So we're going to ask this question this morning. We're going to apply it to ourselves, and I have added to it, of course, since the last time it was preached. But this question is difficult because the text that was read for us by Gary just a little bit ago, those 9 verses are the entirety of the Bible's commentary on this event. There is no other passage that refers to this event. There is no quotation even from this text that occurs. It just isn't found. And so we have 9 verses to try to address this and try to find an answer to this question. But we're going to use those 9 verses, even if they are not quite as much as we would like. And that happens a lot in the Bible, especially in the book of Genesis. We ask, well, why isn't there more about the creation or the Garden of Eden? And then we get chapters upon chapters of genealogy. In fact, even in this chapter, if you're going to divide up this chapter into what you want it to talk about, you'd probably use more than 9 verses to talk about the Tower of Babel and maybe take a few less from Shem's descendants that everybody gets so excited to read about. And of course, it's part of the Bible, and there's a reason it's there, and we talked about that not too long ago. But we have 9 verses. So we're going to ask this question. But first, we'll briefly look at the account. And we know the story, and if you didn't before now, it was just read for us in its entirety, so you know the story. At that time, everybody on earth, okay, that's kind of vague. Who is on earth? Well, the descendants of Noah. How many generations? I don't actually remember exactly. It's not been too long. The estimate is there's probably around 100,000 people or so that exist on the entire earth at this time. And so when they say that they want to get together and build a city, it's not that hard to imagine. A city of 100,000 is really not all that big. So they speak one language. So everybody, as in all 100,000 people, speak one language. Now today, we speak more than one language. Maybe not personally, but on earth there's some 6,500 languages spoken as of right now. And so, why is it that there are now many languages? At the time there was only one? Well, this is the event that explains that. It also explains why people live in so many different places on earth. But this is the story. So they all had one language, and then the people have an idea. Well, what's the idea? The idea is, let's build something. And of course, we often focus on the tower itself, and that's important, I guess, but they also built a city. So verse 4, come let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. So what do they want to build? They want to build a city for themselves, and they want to build a tower. What kind of tower? Well, let me say right here, we don't know what kind of tower. I imagine every time you've seen this tower depicted, it is in a spiral shape or a ziggurat shape. A ziggurat is an ancient form of pyramid building that is a step pyramid of sorts, but instead of it being a traditional step pyramid like you might see in Mayan architecture, instead the steps, instead of going straight up from the bottom to the top, they go around in a spiral. So you would go up one level at a time and follow the stairs as they go up. So why is it assumed that it's a ziggurat? Well, because of where it was built. So it says in verse 2 that the people settled on a plain in the land of Shinar. Well, Shinar is what we would call Sumer, more likely today, and in more general terms, even though it's not exactly true geographically, it's the area of ancient Babylon or Mesopotamia. So it's in that region where today we find these ancient ziggurat structures. Maybe this is going too far into it, but it's going to come up again in a minute. That's why we're explaining it now. But they make this decision. That's what they're going to do. Build a city, build a tower of some sort. Okay, well, the other thing people like to focus in on is in verse 4 that the tower, that its top is in the heavens. A tower whose top is in the heavens. Well, what does that mean? Well, I don't think it means anything extraordinary. Did they think that they were going to build themselves into the place where God dwells that we call heaven today? No. Almost definitely not. Why? Because the term heavens is one of the more generic words in all of the Hebrew language. And it can mean the stars in the sky. It can mean the place that birds fly. It can mean the blue stuff that you see in the middle of the day. It can mean the place where God dwells. So it can mean any of those things. If you go back to the first chapter of this book, you'll see the word heavens, of course, in the first verse, referring to everything above us and the earth. And then in verse 8, you see in God called the firmament heaven. Now, the firmament we usually understand to mean the blue part of the sky and what clouds are against. So heavens is a very general word, and it's used here in a general sense as well. Where was the top of the tower supposed to reach? Not to where God dwells, not to his throne room, but instead just to the sky, as if they could do that. I suppose if they got several thousand feet up, they would hit the clouds, and that would be kind of neat, but I don't think they ever got that close. But that's what they want to do, build a tower that is bigger than anything that's ever been seen. Of course, there's not that much history up to this point, but that's their plan. And God responds to this plan in an unprecedented way. So never before has God responded to humanity in this way, and never again has he responded to humanity in this way. And in a lot of ways, this is about the most extreme response that you could imagine from God, except or short of a global flood, which he's done just a little while before this event takes place. So God, in response, is going to do two things. And we're not sure exactly how the second one happens, but the two things, number one, he's going to confuse their languages, verse 7, that they may not understand one another's speech. Verse 8, and so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth. So two things. He's going to confuse their languages, as in make it impossible for them to speak to each other and understand each other. And then two, he's going to scatter them abroad over the face of the earth. Now, that either happened naturally because they couldn't understand each other and they just kind of parted ways, or it happened in a physical way, that God chose to move these people from one place to another, maybe even across oceans. I don't know. But God does those two things in response. The question is, and the question we're trying to ask, what kind of sin could demand that kind of response? What could be so bad about building a city and building a tower that God would do this in response? So we're going to try to answer that. We've got a few suggestions, and these are the three maybe best suggestions or most common suggestions as to what the sin was that caused all of this to happen. So the first suggestion, and this ties back to what we were talking about architecturally speaking, there are some people, including James Burton Kaufman, who wrote a series of commentaries. He's affiliated with the Churches of Christ, he's deceased. But in his commentary, as well as other commentaries, you'll find the suggestion that this sin that was committed was an attempt at pagan worship in the building of this tower. Now, usually when you hear this suggested by whomever it is supposed based on the fact that the tower was a ziggurat. The problem is there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest the structure, any structure. We have no idea what the structure was of this tower. So later on in history, after this point, we find temple structures to Babylonian and Sumerian gods that are in the form of ziggurats. And so for whatever reason, it is supposed that the original ziggurat that was built was this one at Babel. Again, it's just not there historically. We don't have the original tower. We don't have any knowledge about the tower. I suppose there's some tradition handed down. But certainly, biblically speaking, we just can't make that case. And yet some people do. Now, the other side of this is, yeah, it would make sense. Obviously, if we look in any place where God outlines his feeling toward pagan worship, then God would respond to that sin in a very forceful way. So it would make sense that the sin was pagan worship, seeing the response of God. But just because the punishment fits the crime, that doesn't prove that the crime was what you think it is. or that it happened the way you think it did. It's kind of begging the question here. You're assuming what you're trying to prove about the structure itself that they built, and that doesn't seem to be the problem. Second, I'll suggest that the building of the tower is not the only sin. It's not the only problem. In fact, it's probably the lesser of the two problems that we're addressing. Again, we, for some reason, intensely focus on the tower itself, and we think, well, they were trying to build to heaven. No. Instead, they were building a city and a tower. But the city is mentioned first. The city would be much bigger, much more expansive, and the city is what would actually keep them from being scattered, because they could all live in one place. The tower couldn't do that. So maybe we've placed our focus in the wrong place. Again, pagan worship, it would explain the punishment, but there's just not enough evidence for it. So, of course, if we don't have enough evidence that supports something biblically speaking, then we have to move away from it. So, option number one, pagan worship, it's going to have to be a no until somebody digs up the Tower of Babel, which is not likely to happen. The second suggestion, that's pretty common, is that the sin was that this group of people did not fill the earth, did not repopulate the earth as they were supposed to. Okay, sounds like a kind of weird idea maybe, but if we go back all the way to the beginning with Adam and Eve, then we see a command given to be fruitful and multiply. And we see that same command being repeated to Noah after the flood has taken place. Of course, there's only 8 people to start out, so you're going to need more humans than that on the earth. And so one thing that God says is be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. So if this is a command to the people living after the time of Noah, then it could make sense that the people that gathered at Babel were in opposition to this command. If they are not, they're probably still being fruitful, multiplying, but they weren't filling the earth. In fact, they were saying, well, let's all gather into one place. Well, that's kind of a problem if God commanded them to fill the earth. So it would seem like it's a rejection of this. Specifically, verse 4, it says, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." God says, fill the whole earth. They say, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Those things don't really line up. So it's possible that this is, I'll say, a part of the sin, a part of the issue. Why would that be a problem? Well, it's basic disobedience to God. It's insubordinance to God. If God commands to do one thing and you choose not to do that. And of course, we see that with any sin. And again, if we look at the response, that's verse 4, but if we look at the response, verse 8, the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Also, as another side note, to track back to what we said before, they ceased building the city. Doesn't mention the tower because the tower is actually secondary to the city. But anyway, in this verse, the punishment is given that they will be scattered across the face of the earth. Well, why? Well, if they really were in opposition to God's command to fill the earth, then God says, fine, if you won't do it, I'll do it for you. And I'll place you wherever I want you to go. Kind of makes sense. The only problem with this, and the only question is the phrasing in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, is that a command? And there's a debate on that topic, because the first part of the verse, which we didn't read before intentionally, says, "So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." There is a difference between a blessing and a commandment. So the question is, did God command these people that they fill the earth? Is that a directive that they must follow or they're sinning? Maybe. And I'm not trying to say that God's word is not final, but at the same time, it's saying that God blessed them. And if you were at somebody's wedding and you said, be fruitful and multiply and go take on the world or something like that, and they don't take on the world, is that sinning? Well, no, you're just trying to tell them good luck, I hope things go well. It's a blessing. So it's possible that this really doesn't apply. Second, it's a blessing to Noah and his sons. Now, By extension, his sons would include all of these people. But if it's directly to Noah and his sons, then does it apply? I don't know. So I'm just trying to say that this whole second idea, this whole second option of sin, of not filling the earth, may not be the best suggestion, but it is possible. I'll allow for it being possible, certainly. So unity would be a good thing for these people, and it is a good thing in general, but not when it replaces your need for God, and that's what it seems to have done in this case. So, just to review, we've already said that the first option of pagan worship is not really a good option because there's no evidence for it. The second option of not filling the earth, maybe, but there's not great evidence for it. And then the third option. The third option is true, and it is part of the story. And because of that, I will mention it as if it is the only option. Might not should do that, but the point is pride is present. Pride is there. And we'll look at the pride in this story. So whether or not there was pagan worship involved, we can't prove that. Whether or not they weren't filling the earth, well, maybe they should have been, maybe they shouldn't have been. I don't really know. But what I do know is that there's a big problem in this story. And it's throughout the story. And it's the same problem that we've had for the 5,000 years ever since this story took place. And the problem is pride. Well, where do we find pride? Well, first, let's define pride, because pride is often misdefined. It sounds like splitting hairs, and it's not intentional, but there is a difference between being prideful and being proud. And I know you can use those terms interchangeably, but if I say that I'm proud of Elias, is that a sin? I hope not. And I hope it's not a sin if you're proud of your children. That's a good thing. Or maybe you're proud of this church. Or maybe you're proud of the work that you've done in life. Or you're proud of whatever it is. That's a good thing. And that's perfectly fine. Now, what's the difference between that and being prideful? Well, if I'm full of pride, then I've changed it. I'm not just proud of something, but I'm prideful. And usually that pride is centered on me, not on other things or other people anyway. But the sin of pride is an excessive fixation or a preoccupation with the self, with me, with what I want to do, with what I have done, with whatever it is. My achievements, my status, my possessions, it's all about me. And that makes me full of pride. And so I would be prideful, and it focuses on my own importance rather than God's or anyone else's. So that's what we're going to find in this story. And let me also say, usually when this is suggested, I don't really like it. So whether you're talking about an individual and you say, oh, I think that behavior, that action that this person did was prideful. Well, maybe. But ultimately, that's more something that God is able to judge. Why? Because I don't know their motivations. And if I don't know the motivations, I can't really tell you if it's prideful or not. Or sometimes that even happens in the Bible. We'll look at a different story than this one, and we'll say, well, that person was acting out of pride. Well, I don't know. Do you know what their motivation behind it was? And that determines a whole lot of whether or not someone is prideful or if there's a different issue going on. So normally I would suggest that's kind of a weak argument to say that this sin is definitely pride. But we can be pretty sure here. Why? Well, look at verse 3. So we're going to go through all of these different things. But in verse 3, they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. So they said to one another, let us do this. So if I said to me that we, as in personally me, that I and myself were going to do something, and I had a plan with myself and conferred with me to do this thing, then whose idea is it? Well, it's mine, and it's only mine. And the question here is, and the question we can ask if we want to determine if something is prideful, at least one question, there'll be several questions that have to be asked, is whose idea is it? So when we look at this story and we find that they want to build a city, did God command them to build a city? No. Did God suggest it might be a good thing for them to build a city? Not that we can see. Whose idea was it? It was theirs and theirs alone. They consulted with themselves and they thought it would be a good idea if they did this. Okay. So, of course, if somebody has an idea of their own, that doesn't make them prideful. But if I'm asking if someone's behavior is prideful, and I can ask this question and say, oh, well, no, that's God's idea. They decide that they want to help the poor. Well, God already told us to do that. Okay, that's probably not going to be prideful. But what else is going on in this story? Verse 4. They say, come, let us build ourselves a city. Okay. Overall, in this text, you can just focus in on all of the pronouns that are used of ourselves and they and us and all the things that are about them as a group. And that's what we're doing right here. But in this case, in verse 4, let us build ourselves a city. Again, kind of self-centered, self-focused. And again, they didn't consult God with this, but it's all in their name. Let us build ourselves a city. Let God bless us with a city. Let us pray to God that He will help us to construct a city. No, let us build ourselves a city. We're going to do this for us, because of us, and by our own ability. So the second question you can ask, first one is, well, whose idea is it? But the second one is, who gets the credit for it? Now again, if you get the credit for something, that doesn't make you prideful. But if it's your idea and you get the credit for it, well, we're starting to maybe move a little bit in that direction. But some more things have to be true as well. But God does not get the credit in this situation. Instead, they do. So still in verse 4, they say, after the tower whose top is in the heavens, let us make a name for ourselves. Okay, well, again, that sounds a little bit prideful. Why does it sound prideful? Well, because they're looking at themselves, and they're doing this for themselves, as we've already said, but they're doing this for their own benefit. They're making a name for themselves. So who gets the benefit of this? And that's our third question, I guess. So whose idea is it? Who's going to get the credit for it? But also, who's going to benefit from it? Is God going to benefit from them building a city? No. Is anyone else going to benefit from it? No. Is anybody besides themselves going to benefit from it? No. So, again, if we're asking these questions, it starts to lead us in this direction of thinking this might have something to do with pride. And the fourth thing at the end of verse 4 is, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Now, why wouldn't they want to be scattered over the face of the whole earth? Now, there's probably different reasons. But it seems, at least in part, and maybe this is overstepping here, but it seems at least in part, given what we know about this group already, that they don't want to lose what they have. And that may mean power of some kind. That may mean the ability that they have in working together. It may mean whatever else. But they don't want to lose that. So not only is it for their benefit, but they're also trying to preserve themselves. Their motivation is from the self, for the self. And so when we ask these questions and we put it all together, we say, well, whose idea was it? It was mine. Well, who gets the credit for it? Me. Well, who's it benefit? Well, also me. And who's it going to preserve? What's my motivation? Well, that's going to be me as well. So not being proud, but instead being prideful in this situation seems to be the sin that ultimately is going to lead to God's response of confusing their languages, scattering them abroad over the face of the earth. That response is certainly one of responding to sin, but in addition to that, it's also beneficial to humanity as a whole over time and seems to be part of God's larger plan, but He uses this opportunity to make that happen. We mentioned this verse on Wednesday night in 1 John chapter 2, verse 16. We said that there are, when you boil it all the way down to the very basics, there are three kinds of sin. And the three sins that we look at are the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And these things are not of the Father, but they're from the world. Well, as we've said in this case, they seem to be doing this not because of the Father, not because of what God has told them to do, but instead for their own benefit, for their own sakes. So these three sins are all possible, Lust of the flesh, I don't know if that necessarily has anything to do with this story. Lust of the eyes, possibly, if you want to say that maybe they thought it would look nice to have a city. But the third one is definitely found all throughout this text and in the language that's used in this text. Why? Well, because their pride wanted to build a city for themselves, that everyone could look at them and say, oh, wow, well, these are great people, and actually it would be we're a great people, and we've done a lot for ourselves, and we're important, and we're more powerful, and we're everything that we want to be. And that's pride at its finest. But, of course, when we look in the Old Testament, not in Genesis now, but in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18, it says that pride goes before destruction or before a fall. Well, that's what we find here. That pride was the sin, the factor that was leading into this decision, this construction, and what happens as an immediate result? Well, the destruction comes, the fall comes, because pride was present. Now, certainly this kind of pride is enough to... We'll scoot a little further along. Okay, so pride is certainly enough to demand this response from God, but as I said, I think the response goes beyond just the sin, but it also addresses an overall plan of God to spread people out over the earth. So pride is dangerous enough when it's individual, but pride becomes more and more dangerous as a larger and larger group buys into it. And strangely enough, the entire world at this point said, yeah, this is a good idea. So a couple applications. Number one, again, if the entire world at this time, and maybe it's only 100,000 people or so, but if the entire world says, yeah, this is a good idea, let's build a tower that reaches up into the heavens. If you said, no, I don't really think that would go along with what God wants for us, then who would be considered wrong by the entire world? If it's you versus 100,000, or if it's you versus 7 billion people. So just because everybody agrees on something doesn't necessarily make it right. And certainly that doesn't make it right for us to go along with it just because the rest of the world thinks it. The second thing, and this is obvious enough, but 5,000 years removed from this situation, have humans solved the problem of pride? Not yet. And I don't think it's going to be solved until Christ returns, but pride is still happening, and it's still the root of probably the majority of sins. I don't know, maybe more than the other two, maybe not. It doesn't really matter, but it causes sin on a daily basis. And people still build towers that reach at least to the highest point in the skyline of whatever city it is. And people still build great things for themselves that get handed down to their children who squander it. That's a theme of Ecclesiastes and Proverbs both. But pride sounds like a good plan at the time. And I'm sure this seemed like a great idea at the time. But ultimately, the city was left unfinished. The tower was left unfinished. And people were scattered all over the world as a result. So it didn't work out as well as they'd planned. So the sin of Babel is pride. It's probably not directly tied to pagan worship. It may also be tied a little bit into the not fulfilling of the command or blessing to fill the whole earth. God today still requires obedience, and God today certainly still requires humility. This morning, hopefully you've learned something or relearned something if you were here some 4 or 5 years ago to hear that. But then also, hopefully this morning, if that's something that you struggle with, you're willing to address it, although pride is what stands in the way of that exact action. So this morning, if you can put aside your pride, then this is a great opportunity to respond to the call of God. God doesn't seek out those who have pride. He doesn't seek out those who are great, but he seeks out those who are humble and willing to serve him. This morning, if you're willing to do that, or this morning if you need to come to God for the first time, then don't let pride stand in the way of salvation. Don't let it stand in the way of serving God. If you need anything, come forward as we stand and as we sing.